Well, welcome to this IEEP UK webinar, European Food Strategies, What Can England Learn as the government develops its new strategy. This is a rare treat, an opportunity to learn from our European neighbours about food. What can Westminster learn from Europe as it develops its new food strategy? A turning point, many hope, in government finally taking food seriously. We thought we'd reach that point when Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy was commissioned and published, but that turned out to be a somewhat false hope. One of the great mysteries of my journalistic life, not really a great mystery, really, as you examine the basics of that economic religion of neoliberalism that shaped our lives since the early 1980s, is why has the UK as a whole, but England in particular, paid so little attention to Europe? And of course, there's a question that follows from that. Why have we been so closely in step in the United States' disastrous policies when it comes to food? On the whole, Europeans eat much better than we do. They're not as sick from what they eat. They have food cultures that value eating together. They also cook more than we do. There's a lot to learn. Well, today we have first three speakers from key EU countries who will each give us their take on the key issues for any new food strategy here. They'll have 15 minutes each to set out what they want to say. Stephanie Wunder coordinates Agora Agriculture's work on sustainable diets. Agora Agriculture is an independent think tank. She'll be talking about a new study coordinated by Agora and the French Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, together with other think tanks across Europe. The study examined 11 European countries' recent food policies, looking at the value of taking an integrated and food systems approach. Charlie Brocard is a research fellow at IDDRI, the institute I've just mentioned, working on food practices, food policies, and changing lifestyles. He'll be talking about food policy in France from the French Food Plan of 2010 and promised new national strategy for food, climate, and nutrition. Then from Spain, Eduardo Montero Mansilla, who works as a project and campaign specialist at the Consumer and Users Federation in Spain. He'll focus on the recently released Spanish food strategy and also the Spanish food chain and food waste laws. And then after our speakers, we'll have a panel discussion where we'll be joined by Richie from Nourish Scotland and Ben Reynolds from IEEP, the Institute for European Environmental Policy in the UK, one of the organizers, of course, of this webinar. I'll introduce the two of them properly later. After that, this is the housekeeping, there'll be a Q&A session with questions from me and much more importantly, from you, our audience. So please submit your questions in the Q&A box as you listen. Finally, we'll get an update from Rachel Fisher, who is part of Defra's food strategy team. But now to our speakers. First, Stephanie Wunder.
Thanks a lot, Sheila, for that lovely introduction. And I'm really glad to be here, joining from Berlin. I have read so much about UK food policy, so that it's interesting to now join this debate, and really excited to hear that there will be a new chapter in UK food policy. So next slide. So I am going to talk about a study that is still to come. So you're part now of the sneak preview. So we had a look, and I'll tell you in a second, where's the state of like food policy in Europe currently, and had a particular look at how to change to sustainable diets. So next slide. So there are essentially like three aspects that I want to talk to you, share with you, which is like roughly sharing like what have we been up to with that study, so that you can see like what actually the conclusions we're building on. and then zoom into the two things that are probably a nice frame for that overall discussion, which is like the findings of national food policy, of our national food policy review across Europe, with a focus on demand side policy, so those addressing consumption, and then also about the role and the approaches and obviously the lessons learned of national food strategies. Next slide. So that's the first part. Next slide. What have we been up to? And well, probably with the people joining now this seminar, there's not a lot about to say about like why do we need to work with about like food policy, but of course what we do see, just like as a rough introduction, we do see those multiple challenges related to food and diets, which is obviously all healthy, nutritious diets, but also like the impact of food with regard to environmental resources, to climate change, but also like people facing food insecurity in Europe. And these are like multiple challenges that we need to address also with policies. So the good thing is, of course, then here we do see a lot of like the need to address food policies, but also we see a growing interest all over Europe to, you know, and questions like how to deal with that, how do we address that with policies, although obviously a super sensitive issue, as we all know. So what we have done is we we will, like in 1.5 months' time, we will publish a policy brief then called Towards Integrated Food Policies in the European Union, Country Case Studies in the Role of the EU. So obviously there will also be a part of like what's important for EU policymakers that will not be something I will cover today. And with that policy brief, we want to encourage actually national governments to develop and enhance integrated food policies and show the role of food strategies. And for that, we have collaborated with, it's under the lead of us, Agora Agriculture and IDDRI, Jelly will speak later. And there have been also like 9 other partners from academia and think tanks, also IEEP UK, sharing the lessons learned about the UK food policy. So that's what you can expect from that policy brief. Next slide. And what we have done, I mean, first of all, we have done a literature review of the like gray and scientific literature that we see. And there has also been a recent report by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission that also had this review of food policies, and we will share the link in the chat. What we have done then, in addition, is to really look for good practice examples from 11 European countries. And this is the good practice part is important because what I can already say in terms of lessons learned, we don't see any role model that is covering everything that we want to see in terms of integrated food policies. But we see like from all the ranges of things, be it like policies, so but also like the processes, how to get to these policies, we see really good examples all over Europe. And this is what we try to cover. And I can tell you about some of these policies later, but also about these like processes, what's important. So that is what we have done. That is actually really like showing us the diversity from, be it public procurement, from implementing dietary guidelines, and these dietary guidelines ideally also not just covering like healthy guidelines for healthy diets, but also for sustainable diets. And we're also like covering like different policy measures also in terms of like taxes and junk food ban in schools. So there'll be a lot. So, but long story short, this will only be an appetizer. There will be a lot in, and you can hopefully really look forward to reading the full thing. Next slide. So what kind of findings do we see? Most importantly, it is that we can really see that food policy in the different countries in Europe tend to get a more integrated approach to food policy. If we talk about like integrated, we mean essentially 2 things. The one thing is like we're connecting different policy areas. So I outlined like there are like challenges with regard to like health policy, but obviously also there's a lot about just agriculture policies because food needs to be produced. It's also about like environmental policies, economic, social, etc. So really thinking these together and increasing synergies and reducing trade-offs, this is what we want to see. And this is still more or less not common, but it gains traction. That is one insight that we see. Second super important lesson learned is in the past, we've mainly seen that food policies originated from like agriculture policies, from like production side. And if we want to change food systems, then obviously the whole question of like how healthy and how sustainable diets are is also very much a demand side policy. And these we see particularly underexplored. But of course, if we address these, we really can see that there would be a significant advantage for achieving the different sustainability and health objectives. Third thing, if we want to address these demand side policies, these healthy and sustainable diets, then one thing is particularly important. I'll explain that in a second. And this is policies that promote fair food environments. So these food environment approach, these actually new paradigm to food policy is something that is particularly important. Like if there's just one takeaway from my talk, then it would be that. So they have a significant potential then to, actually create these effective and equitable demand side incentives. Then fourth takeaway is we really do see good practice approaches. So what may seem unthinkable in one country is like, have a look to how the Swedish dealt with like school food, have a look how the Spanish dealt with like food waste regulation, have a look to how Germany dealt with the reform of dietary guidelines. So it's really nice to see things work out. We have different good practice approaches, and that may also then inspire other countries. And then the part that we also will discuss then later more is like these food strategies can actually facilitate a better integration of food policies. If done well, if implemented correctly, if taken serious, if there's budget, etc., they can really help to build these integrated food policies. Next, please. So then for the most important slide, more or less, like if I said, like if you take anything from this conversation, then it would be the role of food environments. So what do I mean with that? In the past, or like still currently, main approach if we talk about like how to support people to change to more healthy and sustainable diets, often the answer is we need to provide more and better information. We need to focus on education. And while there is nothing wrong and it's super important to deal with like information and education, it's not enough. And this is why you see now these 4 dimensions of food environments. So food environments is actually the actually built environment, the cognitive environment that facilitates how we're making our changes in terms of our diet. So in the right bottom part, you see this, there is a cognitive environment. There is a provision of information, of education. There are products may have a label. They have like on-product information about calories. We do see different food education approaches in schools, in kindergartens. We have training of chefs. We have dietary guidelines that want to address people's diets. So all good. But the key point is it only works if actually these more sustainable, more healthy choices are the easier choices. So making it easier means like, and now we're going to the left upper part, are these choices, and let's talk about like, for example, healthy plant-rich diets, because that is a core thing that's good for health, that's good for the environment, that is super important. Are these choices then actually available in restaurants, in canteens, in hospitals, so in retail? So the offer then really matters, or like, of course, in product reformulation, there is a lot to gain for like, healthier composition. So availability, the physical environment are totally important and can be addressed by policymakers, obviously through, for example, public procurement. Then we turn to affordabilities, which we call also the economic environment. And here, of course, it is like, is the healthier choice also the affordable choice? And there are a lot of like instruments, prices, taxes, incentives, subsidies, for example, for school food, for the promotion of fruit and vegetables, also thinking about reducing food poverty, so food aid, that we can use in the kind of toolbox we have. And the last dimension then is appeal. So there's also a socio-cultural environment. So we have opinion leaders, advertisement, marketing that all addresses this socio-cultural environment. And here, of course, we can work with like both campaigns, mobilizing opinion leaders, fantastic example from Finland in the public health campaign there, but also like in terms of like, can we restrict marketing to unhealthy food, for example, to children? Super important. So that is super important that we take the full toolbox of policy instruments to address these 4 dimensions of food environments. Next slide. And now to the last part, thanks, which is the review of the food strategies in Europe. And what do we learn here? So it is interesting to see, I mean, this is compared to other policy areas, still a relatively new policy area, right? So if we look where in Europe we've seen the first food strategies, we would find the first one in Sweden in 2016, then Finland followed, Scotland, Ireland, last year Germany, Northern Ireland, Austria, Spain just this year, France is currently working on one. So this is relatively new, and it's interesting also to see that they vary quite considerably. And sometimes, you know, if there's just this label of like food strategy, it doesn't mean that we're immediately talking about like integrated food strategies that really, you know, cover these different elements of like health, agriculture, social, environmental. Sometimes, let's take the Swedish, that was the first one that we've seen, is really, actually, if you read it, it is pretty much agricultural products marketing export strategy been in the past, right? So it is important to really have a look like what's in there. It has changed since then, going more into the health area as well, covering more aspects but that is something important. Like food strategy is not the same as food strategy. You really need to have a look. Or like in Germany, where I'm coming from and followed this process a lot, we have I would say, very good food strategy in terms of the objectives we see, but there's very little funding behind it, actually. So, and the question is like, how well it will be implemented. And now, do we have review processes, something also that we probably talk about later. So very, very different, very heterogeneous. What we still see is like these processes of developing food strategies, they can really help to set up this needed stakeholder exchange, because like often policies, you know, work pretty much in silos. So it's important to get these health perspectives, these agriculture, these environmental perspectives together and see like, where are the synergies, where are the trade-offs, and to deal with that. So it's really a kind of precondition to have that stakeholder exchange, and developing a food strategy can help. But it can obviously also help to collect the information, to understand the problems and opportunities that we see in this particular country, and then come up with a plan for a coherent policy mix. Also, having had a look at these food strategies that we have analyzed, which is obviously not representative all over Europe, but these 11 countries, we often see a lack of appropriate implementations. So be it a lack of funding, be it a lack of like quantified objectives, because like we need to see like, are we actually making progress, and then adapt potentially the policy instruments, having these follow-up review processes, and then often also having the legally binding measures, so that, you know, if a new government is in place, that it's not taking place all over again. So this is interesting that we have the Spanish case, for example, today in this conference. And then we have, I mean, we would say like, it's not a necessary precondition to have a formal food strategy. It does help a lot. But we've also seen, and we would take Denmark as an example, that has managed without a strategy to come up with pretty coherent policy measures. So it is a helpful tool that we would recommend. It still also works without. Last slide. So essentially what you see here is the different elements of like the development and implementation of food strategies. That is about defining the key objectives, defining key issues that are at stake in this particular country context and the stakeholders, setting these agendas, then prioritizing, obviously, what kind of action to take first. Then, have these defining the measures, implementing that, monitoring it, and then see if you need to adapt, and the whole thing starts again. Totally important. And obviously is that stakeholder involvement in all phases. And I'm showing that because like we've often seen that some aspects have been dealt better than others. And it is super important, obviously, to have all these 5 elements and, really also ensure, this is what I add then on the side, that we address these demand side measures that address fair food environments, with these important aspects of supporting plant-rich diets, reducing food waste, something that's often not really taken into the policy mix, and then make sure that we have good implementation measures, proper financing, adapt legal frameworks, have this continuous monitoring. If we don't see how big the problem is, we can't see if we're making progress. Super important. Sounds boring, but is important to have that data collection. And then always, like, if you have this food strategy or not, because I know that people from other countries are listening in as well, start with pilot projects. This new kind of stakeholder involvement needs to be practiced, like see what works, work on the go, so that you don't wait until 2 years till you have a new strategy and don't do anything in between. So really important also to start with pilot projects in parallel to the development of a full strategy. That was it. I hope there's been some food for thought, and looking forward to talking later then in the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. There was definitely food for thought there. I want to just encourage people in the audience to keep the questions coming in the Q&R box at the bottom of your screen. We'll now move on to France with Charlie Brocard from IDDRI. Welcome, Charlie.
Hi, Sheila. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm very pleased to be here today with you to talk to you a bit about our French food policy and also try to share a few lessons learned from the French case. Although it is quite funny in a sense because we used to, in our discussion with stakeholders in France, make reference to the UK, and here I'm here to do the opposites basically. But you'll see if you learn a few important elements that are useful in your context as well. So yeah, as it was introduced before, I am co-leading this work that Stephanie has been presenting. And part of this work is a series of case studies, including a case study on the French case, which will be released at the same time as the overall policy brief. And here, I'm here now with you to share a few of the elements in this case study, including a more global overview of what have been happening in the French food policy landscape in the past years. Next, please. So just a word about IDDRI first, just so you know where we're coming from, and you can please show the whole slide. We've been working on sustainability issues at different scales and on different sectors for the past 20 years. Just a note about the way we approach food at IDDRI. Basically, we try to put together, or at least have a coherent approach on food from farm to fork, but also have pay attention to what's happening at the household level. And that's also why in the next slides that I will present you, I'm focusing on what is changing or what is aimed at changing dietary lifestyles. And when we do approach those policies that aim at changing dietary lifestyles, we need to take into account what public do they target, to what extent they need, they kind of they change day-to-day lives, and to what extent food practices are able to change due to the food environment in which citizens are making their day-to-day choices. So this is just a quick note, and you can go to the next slide. Yes, first thing I wanted to show you was this kind kind of the main laws and acts that have been shaping food policy in France for the past 20 years. One interesting thing first to show and to say here is that we have been working in France on food first from the point of view of a health or nutrition perspective. So you can see in 2004, the first landmark law about food policy in France is the Public Health Act, during which, when it comes to food, there was a provision already at this time to make it to forbid vending machines in schools. And this was made in with the objective to reduce obesity and to fight against unhealthy food choices. So really in France, we have been having this very strong health focus in the food policy. But then in the most recent years, there's been changing in a sense because we've been having more and more emphasis or interest to food policy from actors both from the sustainability arena and from the agriculture arena. So this is the case for the laws that come afterwards, such as the Avenir Act, which created this local food partnership. In French, it's Projets Alimentaires Territoriaux, to which I think it's a bit similar to what we're having here in the UK with the local food partnerships, but this time it's state-funded, it is state-supported as well. So we have this framework at national level, and then local territories, local authorities, and all other actors can then kind of plug in this framework and propose their own local food strategies. And then we've been having nice and interesting progress on waste and public procurement, which I will be able to touch upon a bit more in the next slides. Can you press, yeah, and show everything twice? Yeah, thanks. And then the other thing I wanted to show you as an overview of French policy is this series of plans and strategies. So as I was saying, we first started working on health. So with the PNNS plan, which stands for Program for Health and Nutrition. Now we are currently elaborating, the government is currently elaborating the 5th version of this plan. And this plan has really been focusing on changing diets. So the objectives are same as in other countries, I assume, lowering obesity, lowering risk of cardiovascular diseases, and all of these. And then the measures that come from this plan have been really focusing on changing diets. And it's actually one of the few programs which has been explicitly targeted at changing diets. Whereas the other plan, which is the agriculture plan here, the PNA, so a program for national program for food, which has been supervised by the Ministry for Agriculture, has not been that explicit in targeting food dietary patterns. It's rather developed a vision and proposed measures on other kinds of issues that are also of interest when you talk about food policy, such as food education, information to consumers, access to food for all citizens, waste, and also the local partnerships. So we've seen in France this parallel work from the two main ministries, the Ministry for Agriculture and the Ministry for Health, having their own plan, their own budget, their own measures, which then there has been an attempt by the government to kind of put them under an overarching framework, which is the National Program for Food and Nutrition from 2019. But this first attempt can be kind of deemed as a failure in a sense, because it was only providing this umbrella document that did not bring new objective or new budget or new political support to food policy in France, but rather kind of associated the objectives and measures from the already existing plans of the Ministry for Health and Ministry for Agriculture without providing a new structure. And it is actually providing a new structure is actually the ambition of the National Strategy for Food, Climate and Nutrition, which has been proposed by the Citizen Convention or Assembly on Climate Change of 2021, where a lot of different proposals were were out of this citizen assembly, but regarding food, there was one important proposal, which is to create a holistic framework for food policy, which would bring together the social, health, education, agriculture aspect under the same framework. So this really was stemming from the citizen assembly, and then was kind of translated by the government into this project to create a new national strategy for food, climate, and nutrition, which should be put for consultation next week, actually. So it's becoming really, really timely. Can you show me next slide, please? What's of interest as well, can you show everything, thank you, is also the main key, like the key players in France when it comes to food policy. As I was saying, we have those two different plans and the measures that are associated to those plans, and they are handled or supervised by the Ministry for Agriculture and the Ministry for Health, which are the main players in the food scene. But then you have also other players that more recently have been participating to the elaboration, but also the implementation of food policy. So first is the Ministry for Ecological Transition, which actually is one of the players that needs to be at the table, that sits at the table for the new national strategy I was just referring to. But that's new because historically the Ministry for Ecological Transition was not part of those discussions on food. Then the Ministry for Solidarity or Social Cohesion, which is in charge of food aid, has also been a new player in this field and trying to kind of bring their own perspective to discussions about changing dietary patterns and the food environment. And then, of course, state agencies are playing a huge role, for example, in defining the dietary recommendations or the public procurement rules, and this is dealt at the national level too. Then you have a set of consultative bodies, which I list here, and they're interesting to look at because they are tasked with the mission to render opinions on different topics pertaining to food policy. It can be food education, labeling for animal welfare, can be very different things. And for the upcoming national strategy for food, climate, and nutrition, they will be tasked with rendering an opinion on these two. And the most important consultative body here is National Council for Food, which is a multi-stakeholder council that brings together actors from every link of the food chain. So you have private actors, you also have NGOs, you have public actors, public bodies, you have the research, and you also have parliamentaries. So this council is also a place where you can have debates about specific food topics, but also more generally about the vision for food policy. And then their opinions can be used by the government to construct and implement policy. Can you show the next? Thank you. And the last thing is also, the last actor is this Secretariat General for Ecological Planning, which was created in 2022. So it's a very recent innovation in French governance of sustainability. And basically, what's interesting here is that this Secretariat General has brought kind of it's a new actor that focuses on sustainability, and it was tasked with the mission both to provide a diagnosis of policy on different sectors, including food, and then bring the different departments together to discuss the future of policy. So it was really an actor that was useful in providing a new impetus, in a sense, to discuss the sustainability of the food sector. And it was also useful in providing a space for different actors which might not have the same interest. And by actors, I mean departments, state departments, that do not have the same interest or the same way to tackle food, to be sitting at the same table with the same diagnosis and sharing solutions to overcome the obstacles that were identified. So it was really a crucial role for this new actor. Can you go to next slide, please? Thank you. And then here is an extract from a publication that we did in 2022, where we decided to assess food policy in France. Here, we decided to cluster the different food policies that we identified in the food policy architecture, and it was more than 50 measures. We decided to cluster them under the same framework that Stephanie just presented earlier, which is the food environment framework with the 4 dimensions you can see here. And we clustered those measures into 21 measure types. And for each of those measure types, we conducted this qualitative analysis in which we identified what was the monitoring, what was the implementation, do we have any information regarding how successful was the implementation, were the objectives attained or not, is the design of the policy optimal or not. And for each of those measures, we conducted this analysis. And the key findings of this work is really that it's, I think, kind of something we also see in different EU or European countries, is that we first have a limit to implementation due to suboptimal design of the measures. One of the key things here is really that for some of the measures, you don't have the right monitoring process, you don't have the evaluation, or you lack a concrete kind of, sometimes measures are not so precise or so accurate, and therefore you lack this last link between elaborating a strategy or a policy and implementing it on the ground. And this was really one of the key findings of this exercise. The second finding is that most of the French food policy are incentive-based, which is a problem when you see in different research reports that incentive-based action is generally not as efficient as regulatory measures. And then the third finding is that most of the currently operating French food policy are less efficient than what is required to change dietary patterns. And when I say they're not the most efficient, I mean that they are mostly information and education based, and you have less action, less measures on the economic aspect, on the sociocultural environment, and on the physical environment. Can you go to the next slide, please? Next one. And then just a quick focus on 2 recent developments, and I will be glad to talk more about it during the panel discussion later. The first development is in public procurement, and the second one is the greening of food aid. As I'm lacking time, I will just focus on the first one here. So in the past years, we've been seeing a lot of activity in the food service and public procurement sector to go towards more sustainability and more equity also in the access to sustainable and healthy diets. One of the key measure and development here is going towards more plant-based diets in public procurement. So first, there was a trial to experiment veggie meals in canteens, which was then made mandatory for 1 weekly option, plant-based option in canteens, and now has been recently extended also to the private food service actors. So it was really a gradual change in the legislation, first starting with an experiment and then extending it to a whole array of different actors to maximize the impact of the policy. And the second policy here is going towards more quality foods, which includes organic, but is not limited to organic food. And the definition for quality is given in the law. It brings together different types of food, including protected geographical indicator food, like PDO and PGI. You also have farm-made. You have Label Rouge, which is a quality label in France. So you have different types of foods which fall under this category. But the objective was really to maximize the share of the sales and of the public procurement that concern such quality foods. And then there was also dispositions on waste and plastics. And I'll go to the next slide, please. And yes, can you show everything? And just a few things is here this ongoing process around this national strategy for food, climate, and nutrition I just talked about, which has been going on for the past 4 years and will end this year. And then a few lessons learned from the French case. I think what is quite crucial is the role of this new actor, the Secretary General for Ecological Planning, in enabling a new context for elaborating French food policy. Then the second lessons learned is the role of temporary tests or trials, which can be a useful way to bring a new policy to the table, experiment, see if it's working or not, see if the implementation is successful, and then extend it. The third one is the way in which the state has been setting objectives, for example, when it comes to reducing waste or increasing the share of organic in public procurement. And this provides an incentive to different actors to act in a clear vision, which is really important too. And the last one is that pacts and voluntary commitments can pave the way for subsequent policies, such as in the field of waste, where we've had a waste pact and then a legislation on waste, and also the same for advertisement and also formulation of industrial products. So these are the key lessons learned. And I end here. Thank you.
Merci, Charlie. We'll now go to, there's a lot there. My video won't work, but we'll move now to Spain with Eduardo Mansilla. Welcome, Eduardo.
Thanks, Leila. Dear all, and say hello to everybody. Firstly, I want to thank you to the IEEP team for preparing this season and inviting CECU as one of the panelists to share our experience in the Spanish regulations. I'm happy to attend on behalf of CECU and sharing with all of you our point of view of this regulation that has been approved in Spain. And I could say that it's not only our point of view, what I'm going to share with all of you, but also the point of view of several organizations we have been working with to discuss how food regulations can be improved to the food system here in Spain. Next slide, please. For those who don't know CECU, very quickly, we are a Spanish Federation of Consumers and Users, founded more than 4 years ago, that includes 10 regional organizations. We defend a broad vision of consumption, in which we incorporate aspects as the environment, and we preferentially pay attention to the defense of the most vulnerable groups. Next slide, please. When we talk about food, our main goal as a consumer organization is to improve access to healthy and sustainable food for all, which is also produced and sold in fair conditions, both for farmers and consumers. On the other hand, while it is important that consumers, all of us, make responsible purchasing decisions, we at CECU advocate that the responsibility to change sides and demand that industry, retailers, and policymakers take the initiative. In order for consumers to make more responsible consumption choice and for farms to farm more sustainably, policies and business decisions need to make this task much easier. To advance this goal, we carry out public and political advocacy work. We don't believe in working from a consumer perspective alone, so we work in alliance with different actors to demand fair and responsible business policies and practices. Next one, please. Okay, well, our point of view when we talk about healthy and sustainable food, we rely on public data, mainly those published by the Spanish Agency for Food Safety and Nutrition, which is part of the Ministry of Consumer Affairs here in Spain. To identify the inadequacy of our dietary patterns to these recommendations, we review the annual reports on food consumption in Spain published by the Ministry of Agriculture. What we identify, as you can see in this slide, is that there is a strong gap between what is recommended as healthy and sustainable food and the diet of the Spanish population. I dare say that it's not just a relay of the Spanish population and could certainly be an example, for example, of the British society as well. When we find this information, we make a question. Is it only our responsible as consumers, as citizens, to have these consumption patterns? At CECU, we believe that is not the case, and that our purchasing and eating decisions are very much conditioned by what we know as food environments. What we find of the supermarket shelves lead us to unhealthy eating. To change this, as well as demanding corporate responsibility, we mostly we mostly demand concrete and ambitious policies that can make healthy and sustainable diets the simplest options for everyone. In this context, today I'm going to talk about four main legislative initiatives that have taken place in Spain in the recent years and in which CECU has participated in the debate. The first of these is known as the National Food Strategy, and in addition, there are three other pieces of legislation that we consider important. The Food Chain Law, the Law on the Prevention of Food Losses and Waste Food, and the Law on School Canteens. Although all these initiatives have positive points, CECU, as well as several social organizations, consider that the opportunity to present really courageous regulations aimed at improving food system is being probably missed. Next one, please. The first one, the National Food Strategy in Spain, was published at the beginning of this year after a year of preparation in dialogue with different stakeholders. With the aim of building a sustainable food system in Spain and in Europe to achieve a strategic autonomy, it promised to be the Spanish contribution to the bloc European sustainable food system framework. Firstly, I have to say that in the end, it has not been a regulation as such, but the path that the Spain food system must follow to achieve the sustainability. Our point of view is that rather than ensuring adequate and fair food production and consumption, both for farmers and consumers, its real objective has been to maintain Spain's food export potential to the rest of the world. In addition, we believe that the opportunity to establish a dialogue between all parties involved to reach consensus has been lost. The conversations have been mostly bidirectional between the ministry and the different agents that has been talked about that, but there has now been opportunities to come together and discuss together the future of agriculture and food in our country. Several organizations, CECU included, are demanding to the ministry a governance board as a national council for food, as Charlie has shown before in France, to analyze, debate, and agree together about the future and the present of food system in Spain. At the regulatory level, in this strategy, what we at CECU criticize the most is that beyond continuing to raise awareness, there is no real and clear strategy to make progress so that the population can have access to healthy and sustainable diets. There are no budgets to support small producers. There are no regulations that move retailers to improve their food supply. There is no obligation to incorporate these healthy and sustainable options in the offerings of public canteens, for example. Nor have we identified any policies or budgets to help those who produce the foods that consumers need most for healthy diets. We don't exactly know how will this strategy continue to achieve the main goals. Anyway, CECU in the following months will continue in the dialogue with the ministry and all the parts involved in this process. Next slide. This is one of the other strategies that has been approved in Spain. This is the food chain law, which has been much talked in Europe. And I understand also in the UK. It was approved at the end of the 2021. So it's been taking a little bit more than 3 years working on. We consider it a positive regulation to improve the efficiency of the sector, an opportunity to protect farmers. And this regulation makes mandatory the registration of contracts between the different agents in the food chain, incorporating important information such as deadlines, production costs, and amount to be paid for farmers. It demands that farmers never to, it makes mandatory that farmers never to be paid below the cost of production, and it establishes fines in a public agency to control that the system works. However, there are several aspects that, in our opinion, make it not working properly. Firstly, to help consumers, it doesn't regulate that final sales prices are equally fair. At a time of economic inflation, we believe that it has not worked to guarantee fair sales prices. An example in the last days is while in recent years the price of the shopping basket has increased a lot, I think in all of Europe, the largest Spanish supermarket has not stopped making profits, and this year, for example, has been announced a profit of 37% of the main supermarket in Spain. We know that there are so many factors, but we believe that at this time it is essential that this kind of laws also includes a control of retailers' extraordinary profits to make fair prices and costs for food. In addition, a demand made by some agricultural agrarian organizations and with CECU shares is that the calculation of production costs that establish the minimum price received by farmers has no control. It all depends on the farmers' calculation and in the negotiation they make with the industry, retailers, or the other actors in the food chain. What we think is that if there is no tool that guarantees this real cost calculation, farmers start at a disadvantage with the rest of the agents, and it is easy for them to have to accept unfair conditions. With this regulation, we also demand that the number of inspections could be increased, as we consider that they are being too few, and also that the amount to be paid for breach of contracts conditions should be higher. Finally, another important aspect we ask is that in order for the food chain to support farmers who produce healthy and quality foods, for example, legumes, seasonal fruits and vegetables, or the organic production, public food procurement should play a key role on, and these products should be prioritized in this public procurement. Also, direct sales should also be facilitated, as is done, for example, in France. However, nothing has been included about all these points in this law. Next slide. This one is the law that aims to reduce food losses and waste. After several years of debate, it was finally passed last week. In this point, firstly, I would like to say that we have not had time enough to study in detail what has been approved, especially since the approved legislative text has not yet been published. We have followed the discussion last week in the Parliament. So what I'm going to tell here today is a close approximation, but it's maybe that there may be some changes. Well, during this process, it has been very complication in the negotiations due to the cross interest of this regulation. For example, there has been an important resistance to include the losses generated in the fields. It was the desire of some sectors only to account the waste that is produced after the field. When we talk about food waste, the focus is generally on what we produce in our homes, because the data show that this is the majority of the food waste. But the causes that produce it are not analyzed, and therefore this prevents the implementation of prevention measures. One of the aspects on which CECU has made the greatest efforts is to quantitatively and qualitatively measure the waste generated in all the slaves of the chain. However, we believe, with the points that we have seen, that in the end, the Ministry of Agriculture will only be forced to measure the waste generated in households, and in the rest of the chain, it will simply publish the data provided by the different agents. We think this is an error, this is a mistake, and we will insist on improving this point. On the other hand, we also believe that the Ministry of Agriculture should have the obligation to provide tools and support so that all agents, especially farmers, can reduce their waste data. How can they do this? Monitoring food waste and food losses, controlling and supporting all the agents. We believe that none of this has been approved, so we will follow up this as well. What has been achieved, or what do we think that has been achieved? It will be compulsory for supermarkets to have contracts for the free donation of surplus food that has not expired. Consumers will be able to take unfinished food from restaurants for free. Businesses will need to have waste prevention plans. In this point, there has been another critical point in the prevention plans, because it has been to ensure that waste prevention is always listed as the first priority, as it was intended to be taken out of the action points. Finally, it seems that for these plans, prevention will always be the first option, followed by transformation into the products into other products for human consumption. And if this is not possible, the third option will be the donation of surplus food. And finally, its transformation into animal feed, for example. But our biggest criticism maybe in this regulation, and maybe this is one of the reasons why it has been achieved the goals that there were expected, is that this law finally in the last year process has been used to approve things that has nothing to do with it. The most scandalous case is that finally, for example, it has been approved into this law that wolf hunting is once again allowed in Spain. We think that hunting of wolf doesn't have to be nothing with food waste. Next one, please. Okay, finally, I want to finish with this regulation that has been discussed during the last 3 years, more or less, and that we are expecting to be approved as soon as possible and as more completed as expected. It is the regulation of the food that should be served to childhood in the school canteens. It's supposed to be mandatory to include much more vegetables and fruits, as we are listening to the Consumers Affairs Ministry. It should reduce ultra-processed food, and help in the necessary protein transition, in which pulses should be one of the key points. It also should include more organic products in the menus and promote source circuits. That's the points that when it started should be included, as the ministry was telling us. Anyway, throughout this process, CECU has collaborated with health, social rights, and parent organizations. Together, we are demanding that these points could be increased. And for example, that menus should be more in line with dietary recommendations, much more pulses, and less ultra-processed food, more fruit and vegetables as side dishes, and less and better quality meat and fish. We are also calling for the promotion of kitchen in the schools themselves that allow these products to be cooked in the best possible way, so that they are as appetizing as possible for children. That it can be extended not only to the lunch time, but also to breakfast and midday snacks. And all of this, in our opinion, should be free of charge for all or almost for the most vulnerable groups, regardless of their family's financial means, can have access to quality food. We are aware that this is a major financial commitment, but we believe that there are a few things more important than proper nutrition for children, and that the schools are a key point on this. About this regulation that should be approved in the following weeks or months, we are currently afraid because we see points that this regulation won't be mandatory for all regions, for all schools, and it won't have a specific budget to be improved. It seems that it will be like a recommendation, and different regions and local councils could accept to implement it or not. So, well, that's currently our main afraid on this. So I think this is the last one I will talk about. Thanks you very much, and I hope I have given you an insight into the path that is being taken in Spain to try to improve food policies and food environment in our country. And in any case, I will be able later for your questions. Thanks to all.
Gracias, Eduardo. The panelists, our speakers, are now joined on the panel by Pete Richie of Nourish Scotland. He's an organic farmer and leader of the organisation, which was key in getting passage of Scotland's Good Food Nation Act in 2022. And also Ben Reynolds, one of the organizer of this webinar, Executive Director of IEEP UK, who's responsible for developing their strategic direction and the programme of activities in the UK. And before he worked here, he worked at Sustain, that's the Alliance for Better Food and Farming, where he helped to set up sustainable food places, Sugar Smart, Capital Growth, and Food Power Networks. He also worked with Jamie Oliver. He worked with Jamie Oliver and his team to get the government to adopt a sugary drinks tax, a very, very important bit of legislation in the United Kingdom and in England. I would encourage you to get the questions, to put more questions into the Q&A box, but I'll begin with one to you, Pete. As I discovered when we were making a program about the Good Food Nation Act before it was passed, you worked very closely with the Scottish government, and it's the only, I think, European example of where you have a holistic approach to the food system that's been put into legislation. There's been enough time since 22. How successful has it been? And what lessons can the rest of us take from it? Peter, are you there? Pete, are you
Or-
there?
Yeah, so thank you. One of the lessons we can take from it is that you don't need a food strategy to make progress on food policy, and you don't necessarily make progress on food policy by having a food law. So it's a necessary, I think, a very helpful but not sufficient condition. So I think since the law was passed in 2022, progress has been quite slow. It's fair to say. The ball went back into government's court. They're required under the Act to make a plan that crosses all the different bits of the food system and delivers on all the outcomes. And there's also a vertical integration bit of it where local authorities also have to make plans. But it's fair to say that the business of policy making for Scottish Government across traditional policy silos has been challenging. I think they've struggled with that. And they've also struggled with, if you like, diffuse political leadership. The strategy is located in rural department, and within that, within the food and drink division. And in a sense, as others contributors have said, for the food and drink division, the food system's not really broken. In fact, we want more of it. So the natural customer of the food and drink division is the food and drink industry. So it's harder even then to craft a food strategy or food plan that goes across health, environment, food and drink, food insecurity, food poverty, and all these issues. So it's a real challenge. So getting the law is really helpful, and the fact that it's based on a human rights perspective is really important, and that we've now got independent scrutiny getting started, but it's been a slow burn.
I mean, those challenges, remember when we talked to you in, I suppose it was 21, you thought that it would lead to a more joined up way of thinking, but you're saying that really hasn't happened between different departments.
I think it's starting to do that. We've heard some sense recently that more ministers are now talking together and realizing they've got to work on this together, and that it can't be locked into simply rural division. Particularly as for Scotland, the major problem with our food system is our terrible health record. As you said at the beginning, healthy life expectancy in Scotland is falling, and there's a huge gap between rich areas and poor areas, and food's the biggest contributor to that. And I'm not sure that message has really got home, that if we want a sustainable economy and a health service that doesn't collapse in the next 20 years, we need to fix food. And that message hasn't really got through yet.
Ben, having heard these presentations, you and what Pete has just said, and your own involvement with food policy at different at levels in England, what advice would you give to the government as they develop their English food strategy?
Thanks, Sheila. And I suppose this responds to one of the questions in the chat. My first, or in the Q&A, one of my first points was the need for legislation. I might have to rethink that after Pete's contribution, but I still believe that well crafted, it's the missing piece after years or decades of voluntary measures. There must be a role for regulation. I think when Steve Reed announced in December that he was going to do a food strategy, within the kind of the questions that came up after that, it sounds like everything is on the table. They haven't ruled out regulation, so I think we should definitely be exploring that. When you look at the last two strategies that the UK, well, England did, the last two governments, they tended to release them after a couple of terms in government. So it took them about 10 years to do a food strategy, and those food strategies were only in place for a short period before each of those lost power. So there's some hope that this announcement has come out so soon within this new government. But it really highlights that risk of the risk of continuity of commitments. And I think that's why Scotland's example is very interesting. And I wonder, I think it'd be good to follow up with Pete about whether the regulation could have gone further, whether there's the potential to be adding in more targets within that regulation. When you look at things like the Environment Act in the UK, is there something we could be learning from that for food? And this was, of course, a recommendation in Henry Dimbleby's strategy. We've now got places like Slovenia that are looking to do a similar legislative approach and to put some of the commitments for targets and metrics into public procurement. And the other thing I'd say is really, really crucial is that need for oversight and delivery and scrutiny, which is why it's so timely that we've seen the announcement for the Food Strategy Advisory Board just on Friday, which I think is welcome to see that announcement. Its role in developing strategy. It's not yet clear whether it's going to have a role in overseeing its delivery. I think there needs to be more clarity on the membership terms of reference, getting that balance of perspectives, and potential to rotate in future. And I think this is where it would be interesting to hear a bit more from Pete and some of the speakers about the parallels in their countries. So I think one of the key things about that announcement isn't so much the advisory board, but it's the ministerial food strategy group that's being announced, which would hopefully provide that cross-departmental oversight. And of course, we'll hear from Rachel at the end from Defra, so hopefully a bit more about that. But that sounds quite similar to what Charlie was talking about in France. I think that's really important. But I think the thing that's sort of missing within all of this is that, I suppose, that body that can actually scrutinise, is government delivering on those ambitions that come through in the strategy? So is there a parallel with the Climate Change Commission? Is there, I mean, I think this is something that in Scotland they're looking to create some independent food commission, but those would be some of the clear things I think we need to see in place for this new strategy.
I mean, I'll put to you, you've probably read it in the Q&A, a question from Roberto Rivera Fernandez, and I'll shorten it, but he's looking at these food experts that are joining the government's food strategy team or advising. He says, why would a government choose a heavily industry-led group of consultants instead of trying to represent and give voice to a broader spectrum of the food system? Why?
Why? I'm not sure I can answer that. I think on the surface, there are certainly some gaps there. And I think
it looks like Anna Taylor will be carrying a lot of weight there.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like it's Anna Taylor and the rest of it's all industry. There are some other important perspectives there. So the Food Standards Agency, for example. But one hopes this is an initial list of people and that there will be others to be announced to join that board to fill in some of the gaps, which I think you rightly identify.
Yeah,
Okay.
if I could just...
Sorry, Pete, go on.
No, just on that, I think certainly when Henry did his food strategy, and I think everything I've heard from Steve Reed is that there's not really an attempt as part of food strategy to tackle this issue about differential access to healthy food, and the gross inequalities we have in the UK in terms of healthy food consumption. And unless you have an equity lens on this, and you bring the DWP into it, it's very hard to see how you're going to tackle the most important problem in our food policy. And it's not clear from Steve Reed yet that that's part of the mix. But just picking up on Ben, I'm not saying we shouldn't have a law. It's great we have a law. It's just going to take, it's a 20-year job, this, and it's going to take the first 5 just to get our feet on the table. And the Independent Food Commission, likewise, it's statutory, it's got powers, it's not industry-led, it's independent. How effective it'll be, again, depends to some extent on how active civil society is to also put pressure on that to be robust, so it's about, but it is a useful external body, ideally a bit like the Climate Change Committee, to say, we've looked at the numbers, we need to go further, you're not implementing policy effectively. So.
Thanks. Okay, Stephanie, do you think it's possible to say that there is real added value in governments or nations producing a holistic food strategy, as opposed to just individual issue-specific food policies? And I'll do a follow-up about my experience recently of Amsterdam and Copenhagen, which have been, policies there have been very influential, and they're not national food strategies. They're not national. Anyway, Stephanie.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, if you want to show my camera, it's out of my power, so the organizers would need to do that. So yeah, thanks, yes, Sheila, for the question. So if I understand correctly, like, is there value in these holistic strategies? And I mean, I hope that I got this across. It's like super relevant and helpful, because what we often see is actually that policies go against each other more or less. So we do not really have this coherence, which is essentially also a waste of taxpayer money. So so that's a clear yes. And if I may take this opportunity, having listened to many things that have been said by Pete, Ben, but also in the Q&A, I kind of feel that we also have a little bit of this gap right now in what we have presented, which is like, who is involved in setting up these strategies? and also obviously to how to deal with like economic interests in that whole setting up. So, and this is obviously super important. Like if we want to get these holistic perspectives, we need to be aware that there is economic interest in the room. And then as Pete just said, like, I mean, who is responsible also for integrating these different perspectives from different departments? And here we need to see like two approaches. One is like to improve like the governance. And we have seen, for example, in Austria, where like, the government thought like, okay, so it isn't a health issue, it's an environmental issue, it's an agriculture issue. We set up a new service agency trying to collect all that together, right? Rather than putting it into one of the silos. So super important to think of new structures to integrate these perspectives. So I would echo what Ben just said, like this cross-departmental, super important. But then also like, I mean, I obviously don't know like who's yet in the English Food Strategy Advisory Board, but like, this is then super important that we have represented these vulnerable groups, those representing societal interests, and then really be careful with economic interests represented in there, because what we have seen in the past is that often like food industry representatives and media have really worked against these policies. So that is something to consciously take. And the third and last point I would want to make is like, because like the question is like how to deal with that. We have seen two really great processes. First in Germany, where the whole group of like, be it farmer unions, be it a consumer representative, be it science, being brought to a table to agree on a compromise, like kind of like what can we agree on? And then the same guy, Peter Strohschneider, also facilitated the dialogue of the strategic dialogue on EU level. And there has been compromises. And then it needs this political leadership to actually implement that has been agreed upon. And I could just like very much encourage to set up these kind of strategic dialogues to really agree on these compromises with scientists, with societal groups in the room, that then also like see how we get these societal objectives agreed. Full stop. I hope that's partly answering your question.
That's a very good answer. I was just recording in Copenhagen, and we made a program last year looking at the food policy, the obesity policy in Amsterdam, and I was very struck by what a profound difference city policies can make over a whole country. They're not national, but, well, you talk about them, you know them.
Yes, and I love it. Thanks for actually this part of like holistic food strategies, and that hasn't been come up also in the discussion here, but also in the Q&A. If we talk about like holistic or integrated food policies, it's not just a matter of like crossing the policy areas. It's really a matter of like this kind of vertical integration, like EU policies, well, EU, okay, we're here like for UK, but national, regional, local. And you're totally right. There's so much power in implementing these policies on the local level, because they have a lot of power, be it like, if you talk for Amsterdam, you have like publicly available drinking opportunities, right? So that's one thing. Copenhagen, fantastic public procurement, training chefs and kitchen stuff. So really nice. You really have the power, and usually it goes without this big, huge attention that is then, causing the media trouble. So yes. Local level, super important. And their representatives need to be in these boards. And that hasn't been, for example, been the case in Germany either. And they're so important. And they can bring this pragmatic view on how it's actually getting done.
I mean, I think that's such an important point, because it shows local authorities the power that they have. And you often get the sense that they think they don't have power. And yet look at these two cities. And in fact, in this country, in Leeds, you've had profound changes. Anyway, here's a question for Charlie. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Charlie, the Westminster government is looking to put in place public sector procurement targets with a commitment for 50% local and sustainable. Would you say, from your experience in France, that this is achievable? And what would be the key points you'd say to them? You'd say, if you're going to do this, you need to do X.
Nice question. What I presented earlier is exactly the same type of objective. As in France, we have this objective that's 50% of the food served in public procurement is sustainable or quality food. And I said it was kind of politically defined perimeter. It's not scientifically defined. And then within this 50%, you have 20% for organic food. And the way in which the government proceeded is first kind of set this objective, and then with the work of different state agencies and working also with local authorities representatives, trying to see what were the main hurdles that prevented local authorities from attaining this objective, and then providing basically guidelines or platforms and a bit of funding to help them attain this goal. However, what we see now is that this objective should have been already, I mean, in the law, it should have already been attained in 2022 when it comes to public procurement. But today, the most recent number that we have, and actually it's not the most exhaustive number because we don't have the reporting for all cantines in France, but the most recent number is 29%. So we still see that even though it's 3 years later than the set date, we were not able to reach our objective. And that's, I mean, when you discuss with public authorities or when you read the reports, that's for a lot of different reasons. But one key reason, and that was actually something in a Q&A, is the funding. Because the state was able to provide guidelines, was able to provide a more favorable regulatory environment to provide local authorities with the opportunity to meet the objectives, but they did not save new or provided new fund for this. I mean, one of the things I showed in my slide at some point actually said there was this €1 meal plan, and this was actually a mean for the state to provide a bit more funding to municipalities that wanted to meet both social and sustainability objective, but this was quite small funding in the end. So that's really the key issue here. The elephant in the room is the funding. And that's also why, just to pick up on what was said earlier about the role of public authorities, I mean, of course, I agree. It's really important to keep them in the discussion, to also make sure that the different level of policymaking are mutually reinforcing. However, the thing is, public authorities sometimes don't have the direct competence, and therefore sometimes you have an issue with finding the right angle to elaborating your policy. And then most generally, at least in the French context, they lack also the funding for implementing the policies that are elaborated at national level. And that's the case for public procurement. That's also the case for the other policy I mentioned, which is the local food partnerships. That's the same thing. For both policies, we lack funding, and we lack a more we also lack political support. And I think that's the last point maybe I want to emphasize is when you have, and it also goes back to your discussion earlier, if you have better cross-departmental, cross-ministry discussions, then maybe that's useful because in that sense you're able to put different objectives in the same strategy or to improve coherence. However, if then you don't have the political support that is brought by, for example, a ministry for food or an interministerial whatever, like some person which would kind of embody the food policy and bring it power, bring it political embodiment, basically, then you also miss something.
Thank you very much. We're beginning to, we'll get very tight for time. So a quick question to you, Eduardo. Whilst the Spanish food chain laws were intended to rebalance power in the food chain, particularly for producers, and we heard your skepticism about this, do you think it's had any environmental impact? Has it reduced food waste?
We don't think so. The last data that we have about food waste, it doesn't show this to us. And mainly the food losses in the files aren't so much accountable, but we think that the food chain law hasn't had impact on the food waste.
Well, thank you. That's not very
We
helpful,
hope that we can get new data in the following months, but
yeah. there are so many good questions here. You know, there's one from Star Maltino. I don't know who to ask this really. Ben, I suppose, how do we integrate environmental costs of food production into the true price of food? That's a big question at this point.
It is a big question. I hadn't seen that one before. I mean, there's countless pieces of work and lots of advocacy from various different civil society groups on this. But I think, I mean, this actually goes back to the funding question. One of the clever things that Dimbleby did with his strategy is that it was fully costed, and I think we should flag that. His first and main proposal was for a sugar and salt tax. And I know there's been a lot of work by various different groups around the Recipe for Change consortium proposing something similar. I think the government does need to, particularly in the current funding situation, financial situation, it does need to look very carefully at models like that. I know this is slightly different than the question. It's not about necessarily embedding the cost into what you see on the shelves. It's a different way of doing that, but it might result in the same rebalancing whilst also raising some money to actually go towards some of these different initiatives.
Great, thank you. I'm going to read out this next question. I'm not expecting an answer from any of you, but it's part of my introduction to the person who's going to speak just for a few minutes. And it's from Ian Quinn, and he says, to Defra, to what extent will Henry Dimbleby's proposals be used as an off-the-shelf policy to be given the go-ahead by the new board? And I wonder, I'm not sure Rachel Fisher, who we have here, who is Deputy Director of Food Security and Coordination at Defra, will be able to answer that. But she is part of the team developing this new food strategy for England. And she's kindly agreed to give us a couple of reflections on what she's heard for the last hour and a half, and some information on timings and follow-ups around the new food strategy. And we're very glad that you are here, Rachel.
Thank you. I am really glad to be here as well. So I'm about a month into to this role, and I've been listening to a lot of different stakeholders from across different sectors within the food system, but also more broadly as well, and an avid listener to the food program. So very exciting.
Thank you.
And I think one of the things I just wanted to say is that this Food Strategy Advisory Board is super important in terms of how we work with people from across the system and bring them together into a room where we can have conversations, test ideas. But it's not the only way in which we're going to be talking to people. We are also working with different stakeholder groups, the Food Foundation, Food Farming and Countryside Commission in civil society. So lots of people. We recently had a number of conversations with senior academics from kind of again across the food system. So the idea is to try and bring in as much information as possible and build on the work that Henry did for the government a couple of years ago and kind of add to that. So it's not like we're starting from a blank piece of paper. We know we are not starting from a blank piece of paper. There is a lot of information out there. And one of the things that I found really heartening to listen to all of these different kind of European food strategies is just how much we are all dealing with the same problems, the same questions, and hopefully able to learn from one another in terms of building up a kind of shared sense of solutions. So we do have the Food Strategy Advisory Board, and as Ben said, we've also got the cross-government ministerial board bringing together Defra, where I am, but also health, education, business and trade, housing communities, and local government. So I think also this place lens, this idea about like how do we understand food as something that happens in place is incredibly important, as well as working with local government on how they can be part of the partnership that delivers a real change, a meaningful change in the food system. So I just want to say thank you guys so much for the information that you're giving us, and I'm looking forward, Stephanie, to reading the actual final report. So that'll be really interesting for us. But there are ways of getting in touch with us through. Now I've completely lost it. But if you kind of email into this group, I'm sure that I will pop into the chat in 2 seconds, like where you can email us more directly if you want to be more involved. Thank you.
Responding to that, Rachel, sorry, I hadn't switched on all those buttons. I think a lot of people will want to be in touch with you. So something will go up on there which will enable you to get in touch with her. I felt when I was asked by Ben to sort of chair and be the referee for this, which hasn't really been needed, but that 1.5 hours was quite a long time, and now I realize we've barely touched things. Anyway, it was an education for me, which is not central to this. I think it must have been an education for many of the people in our very large audience. Thank you for such smart questions from them. I wish I could have asked more. And thanks to all our really good speakers, Rachel, Stephanie Wunder, Charlie Brocard, Eduardo Mansilla, Pete Richie, and Ben Reynolds. A great 1.5 hours. Thank you all.